Okay, it's going to go a bit kaplooey for a minute until I get the PowerPoint up. Screen. Is that okay? Everybody see that? So right, if I'm sharing the entire screen, when I want to go to the video clips, I don't need to go back in and close the PowerPoint. I can just go to the video clips. All right. Okay then, so baby is born and healthy and typically developing. So they're going to be around 7.5 pounds, about 30 inches in length. And the movements that we see from the baby are involuntary at this point in time. So when the baby is born, it doesn't have any voluntary control over its muscles and its body. Okay? So it takes a few months to get to the point where we have some voluntary control. So these very early movements that we see, we have to remember are involuntary. The baby's not controlling them. Now that doesn't mean that the brain isn't initiating them, but there's no conscious control of the movement. All right? So the idea that the researchers have is that these involuntary movements provide some foundation, some building blocks for movements that are going to be coming along later on, right? So they have this relationship with later voluntary patterns that we might see, all right? And we have two kinds of involuntary movement. The first is spontaneous. In some textbooks, spontaneous movements are called stereotypies. And these kinds of movements just occur without any stimulus, all right? So they're really interesting because you don't have to do anything, they'll just suddenly happen, right? And they're very, they're much more coordinated than they look from the outside. So if, so baby researchers will put little markers on the legs and on the arms and film them and do a biomechanical analysis. And there's actually a lot more coordination to these stereotypies or spontaneous movements than it appears from the outside, okay? The other type of involuntary movements are reflexes. Reflexes are different because they occur in response to a very specific stimulus. All right, so if I do the stimulus, we will see the reflex if the baby is typically developing. All right. So, let me switch this out and show you this bit of film of stereotypies. So here the baby is wobbling their arms a little bit. There's a little kick in the legs. Right? So this is not voluntary movement. The baby isn't consciously kicking her legs. All right? These are stereotypies because there wasn't any stimulus applied to the baby before we see the leg kick. All right? And all these film clips are on your student web guide for the book, so I would highly recommend that you spend time going and watching more of them as you work through this chapter. So, as we said, stereotypies have no stimulus, reflexes do have stimulus. It's a very specific reflex to a very specific stimulus. They don't muddle each other up, right? One stimulus equals one reflex. And sometimes they're just one muscle, sometimes it's a little group of muscles, but it's not the whole body in the way that we sometimes see with the stereotypies. And some of these reflexes stay in place, exist throughout our whole lifespan, right? So a startle reflex, for example, we see in adults. If you're walking down the street and a car backfires, you jump, right? That's a startle reflex, and that doesn't really ever go away. A knee-jerk reflex doesn't go away. So we still have some reflexes that we maintain as adults. A really important one is the withdrawal, right? So if I put my hand on something that's hot, I pull my hand away very, very quickly, right? There's not time for that sensory information that I put my hand on something hot to go all the way to the spinal cord, all the way up to the sensory cortex, for the motor cortex to initiate that stimulus, right? So it has to be happening as a reflex at the spinal cord level. Okay. So we don't think that these baby reflexes are necessarily extinguished at any one time. We do have a time frame for a typically developing child for when we will see certain reflexes and then when we see other reflexes. And that's very useful because that means that the pediatrician can test the reflexes and see whether or not the baby is exhibiting typical development. If there's some persistence of a reflex past the range of time that we would expect to see that, then that may indicate some neurological problem and they would investigate further there. Okay. So reflexes, in our textbook, they divide reflexes into primitive, postural, and locomotor. So we've got reflexes that seem to have specific jobs. Okay. So some of the reflexes, particularly the primitive ones, seem to be there to facilitate survival for the baby. All right. So remember that they're in response to sensory information. So the brain is learning to recognize some sensory information. It's starting to encourage a dialogue with the environment, particularly with the caregiver, if that's mom or whoever. Okay. One of the primitive reflexes that we see is called the asymmetrical tonic neck. And if you look here, in this reflex, you lay the baby on its back and you turn the baby's head to one side. And what happens, the reflex to that stimulus of turning the head, is that the arm and the leg on the side that you turn the head to shoot out. All right? So if you consider what's happening there, right? If you put the baby down on a surface that isn't even, for example, and turn its head, it would roll, right? And maybe end up smothering itself. So by turning the head and then shooting out this arm and leg, it stops the baby from rolling over and smothering. Okay? So some of the reflexes seem to have a very obvious job. Some of them are a bit more subtle. Typically, our primitive reflexes are weakening by around 4 months or so, and we're starting to see other reflexes and the beginning of voluntary movement. Oops. So one that everybody kind of knows is the grasp reflex. So we have two kind of grasping. We have a palmar grasp and a plantar grasp on the foot. So the palmar grasp is that you touch the palm of the baby's hand, and what happens is the fingers curl over, okay? And so then your finger is stuck, or your necklace, or your hair, or whatever it was that touched the baby's hand, because the baby can only close its hand, it can't open the hand again. So then you have to kind of pry the fingers off to get your hand back, right? And that's a very cute reflex. It always initiates some gooing and, oh, you're so cute, look how beautiful you are, right? So it creates some interaction. Everybody thinks it's really cute that the baby grabbed their finger. The baby didn't grab the finger because the baby can't move for itself yet, right? It's a reflex, okay? We also see one on the foot, so if you press the ball of the foot, the toes will curl over. All right, that one's an interesting one because until that one has weakened, it's very difficult to put shoes on the baby or get the baby to stand up and walk, because as soon as they stand up, they're pressing on the balls of their feet and their toes start to curl. Okay, so that reflex has some implications for upright movement and things. Right. Then a symmetrical tonic neck, the baby is sitting up and you're supporting the baby, and you can either tip the baby's head back, right, and the arms will extend and the legs will flex up, or you can tip the baby's head forward and the arms will flex and the legs will extend. Okay. So they're just this interaction between the sensory system and the motor system that the brain is learning about. So about 16 weeks or so, we start to see some postural reactions, and these reflexes really look like they're teaching the brain how to manage this body in response to gravity and all these other things that, it's growing very rapidly. So at 16 weeks it is significantly larger and heavier than it was at birth, right? And so the brain is having to, what do I do with this body, right? So they start as a reflex in response to a stimulus, and then some of them turn into or get consumed by voluntary movements that look very similar. So one that's cute to watch is the labyrinthine writing reflex, and as you can see in the picture, here you support the baby and you tilt them to one side or the other. Now, humans are very much wired to be upright and have their head level, right, with their body. So at this age, when you lean the infant over, the brain is still trying to keep the head upright for as long as it possibly can. So it can look very odd. So here you can see she's tipped the baby over quite a lot, but the baby is trying to keep its head upright. My notes are not in order. What's going on here? Okay. A couple of others that you can see very easily, one of which we still have as adults. So derotative writing, you lay the baby on its back, and this time when you turn its head to one side, the body, remember the brain wants you lined up in one line. So we turn the head to one side, this initial primitive reflex has weakened, and now what we see is the shoulders and the body will make an attempt to roll and line up with the head, right? Or you can do it the other way. You can turn the legs and the pelvis, and then the baby will turn its shoulders and its head to get lined up again, okay? The next one, parachute, never seems to go away, right? And it's an interesting one, I think, from a sport perspective, because it is one that causes a lot of injuries in a PE class or a sport environment, okay? So on a parachute reflex with a baby, you hold the baby and you lower them towards the ground quite rapidly, and so what the brain gets is this very fast kind of floor coming up to its eyes, and so it gets all this visual stimulus. And what happens is the arms and legs extend towards the floor. All right? Now, think about what you do if you trip. Right? What's the first thing you do, or you fall forwards? What's the first thing as an adult you do if you trip or you are falling forward? So this often causes problems in sporting environments. It causes problems with the elderly. If they trip on a rug in their house or they slip on some snow or some ice, right, leads to a lot of broken wrists, dislocated elbows, things like that. Okay. So one other reaction that again is important because it's related to standing and walking. Until it weakens, it's very difficult to stand and walk, is a Babinski reflex, right? And we stroke the bottom of the foot and all the toes fan out. Okay. So then we have our last category, locomotor reflexes, right? And these really look like they're going to become voluntary movements, right? So one that is important from a research perspective is the stepping reflex. And the stepping reflex The stimulus is to hold the baby and put the soles of their feet either on the table or on the floor. And the reflex is that the baby will then pick its feet up, and it looks like it's walking, but it's not walking, it's a reflex. Right? So these locomotor reflexes appear earlier than the corresponding voluntary movement that we see after the reflex has disappeared. All right? Now, some really interesting research on the stepping reflex gave us a new perspective on the idea that reflexes disappear. Okay? Because what they did was they took a baby and put it in a bathtub. Right? And this baby on the ground had stopped producing the stepping reflex. And so this is where historically researchers thought, well, that reflex now has gone away and the brain is working on developing the new voluntary motor pattern. Okay? But what they found was this baby could not do a stepping reflex on the floor. But when they put them into a big tub of water, a big bath of water, then the stepping reflex reappeared. Put them back on the floor, baby doesn't do the stepping reflex. Put them in the tub of water, we see a stepping reflex. All right, so it's a very vivid picture of our constraints triangle, right? As well as explaining some of what's going on with these reflexes. Because by around 5 or 6 months, this baby is very chubby, right? And so when the reflex disappears on the floor, it's because the muscles aren't strong enough anymore to lift the legs up and down, right? When I put the baby into the bathtub and the baby's weight is supported by the water, right? So I change the environment, we expect to see a change in the motor pattern, and there's a stepping reflex, right? So it's like the water will support the weight of the baby. It's why we use swimming pools to rehab athletes and racehorses and things like that, right? Because if I can support the weight, I can work the injured site with less stress. Right? So what we found when that research was done was that the stepping reflex doesn't disappear, it just gets overwhelmed by other constraints. So, remember these reflexes are involuntary. So some of them seem to facilitate survival, some of them allow the beginnings of dialogue with the environment and with the people in the environment, right? Every time the body moves, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, the brain receives sensory information about that movement, and so the brain can start to expand its repertoire of understanding sensory movement. All right? And then these locomotor reflexes in particular seem to be providing some foundation, some building blocks for movements that are coming that are going to be voluntary. And then we start to get voluntary movement, right? So the baby is going to be experimenting with moving arms, legs, head for itself, okay? So in the book they call these fundamental motor skills. I think that's really confusing because our fundamental motor skills are our set that is on the MSU chart and the TGMD and those kinds of skills. I prefer, one of my other textbooks calls this level of motor skills rudimentary. And I do think that that's a helpful way of thinking about it. All right, and if you go to, let me find this in the new book. Where's my milestones? There we go. On page 56, there's a table that shows the motor milestones. So these are points in time, movements that start to occur that signify growth and development in the central nervous system and the muscular system. Right? So we've got some specific movements that now can lead to a general outcome. Right? When you look at those milestones, right, they were developed a long time ago. All right? So one of the things that it's tempting to say is that babies nowadays, right, they've got much better nutrition, they've got better toys, and so they're going to achieve these motor milestones a lot earlier. But actually, the research indicates that they achieve them at roughly the same time as they did 80 years ago, right? So it seems quite I think that that represents the fact that these motor milestones are quite hardwired, right? These are genetically driven movement skills that are going to occur in a particular order if the baby is typically developing. Okay. There is another model that they talk about in the book that they don't have a picture of, so let me see if I can draw this for you. So far then we've had a model to explain movement that's our triangle, our constraints. We've had the pyramid with the top cut off, right, the Seefeld pyramid. And then there's another model that crops up in a lot of the research and in a lot of the textbooks that is the hourglass. Right, so the hourglass doesn't have a big cut in the side like that. Oh, it's so hard to do this on there. Here we go. All right, that's meant to be an hourglass, okay? And so the original one, the authors actually have a much more recent version, but I think the original one gives us a good picture of what they were trying to get at. So the sand runs, you tip the hourglass over, the sand runs from the top to the bottom, right? And what this model tries to represent in a similar way to Seefeld, but just using a different picture, right? The bottom layer of the sand is reflexes and stereotypies. Right? The next layer of the sand is rudimentary skills. So we have a rudimentary layer. The next layer is our fundamental motor skills, right? Which is the ones that we have been particularly looking at during the lab, okay? And then the next layer they call specialized movement. And that's looking at specific sports skills or life activity type skills, okay? And the idea is that in order to get to the specialized, you have to feed enough sand, and the sand represents experience in movement skills, right? So in order to get to the specialized level, we have to feed enough experience in for the child to move through these steps. Does that make sense? Sorry for the very bad picture. Okay, so by about 8 weeks, if you put the baby on its tummy, it can start to lift its head a little bit, right? So think about the muscles that support your head, right? And remember the diagram that we looked at a couple of weeks ago where we looked at the ratio of the size of the head to the body of the baby, right? Remember that the head is very large in comparison to the body, okay? So we've got to think about what are the muscles that would move the head. So if I'm going to move my head this way, it's these long diagonal muscles here. They're not very big, right? I mean, you can feel them, but they're not huge, okay? Think about the muscles that help me move my head this way, right? You've got these two great big thick ropes of muscle in the back of your neck that can contract and move your head that way, right? So it makes perfect sense that the baby can move its head from lying on its tummy before it can do anything with it lying on its back. Okay. By about 3 months, so 12 weeks or so, it can not just lift its head, but start to lift its shoulders up a little bit, which means it can start to turn its head a little. All right, so the beginnings of voluntary movement are giving the baby an opportunity to look at its environment. It's really, really important that babies get tummy time and aren't left lying on their back all the time. Okay? Tummy time has had some bad media in the past because people linked it to SIDS, to sudden infant death syndrome, and so there was a period of time where parents and teachers were told not to put the babies on their tummy, that they have to be on their back. The problem with putting them on their back is they can't move, right? So you lie on the back, and all I get to do is stare at the ceiling all day, right? That is not developing my brain or my cognitive awareness, right? So tummy time is very, very important. But you don't put the baby on its tummy and walk away and come back half an hour later, right? You spend time with the baby. Okay? So think about the constraints, the size of the head. Okay. Let me show you that video because that's very cute. See how aware he is? Very alert. The legs are stereotypies. Right? But he's very alert because he can lift his head up and look around. And humans are inherently inquisitive. Right? We like to know what everything is, what's going on, what's that noise, who's that person. Right? And so the baby spends a lot of time watching and learning. So by about 5 months, the baby can now start to roll itself over. All right, so if you lie it on its back, it can roll over to its tummy. If you lie it on its tummy, it can just about get over onto its back. And by about 5 months, particularly if mum and dad have been spending a lot of time practicing it and doing the skill, the baby can sit up unsupported. Now, at 5 months, that sit-up is very much based on the center of gravity and the base of support. All right? So when we say they can sit up unsupported, we're not saying that they can sit up and do this. They sit, they kind of bend. Oops. Right? So my center of gravity is so over my base of support, I can just stay there. Right? It takes a little bit longer to get to the point where I can control my torso and sit upright. Okay? But sitting up unsupported is a great milestone because now my hands are free to start exploring things that are put in front of me. Right? So it allows me now to start playing with toys, to start exploring what things do. Okay? So by 7 months, we're getting ready to start to creep. So at 7 months, the baby is able to get up onto its hands and knees. And then the brain goes, oh, now what? Right? So I'm on my hands and knees. Well, that's good. But what do I do now? Right? So the brain has to work out weight transference. Right? Because if I'm going to lift one hand up, I have to transfer my weight over to the other side of my body so I can lift that hand up. So going from hands and knees to actually creeping takes a few weeks of practice, right? And often what you'll see when they first get up onto their hands and knees is they'll start rocking backwards and forwards, right? Because the brain's trying to work out, okay, how do I get my hand up off the floor or my knee off the floor? Plus, I have to get the front of my shoulder strong enough to support my weight when I take one hand off, right? So we get lots of this kind of rocking motion on their hands and knees for a few weeks. And then they start to creep. On average, about 8 months, right? Some babies will creep earlier than 8 months. Some babies will take longer than 8 months to creep. Some babies don't creep, right? So another interesting constraint that can change the motor behavior that we see is the surface of the floor, right? So what are they growing up on, right? Is it nice squishy carpet? In which case, they probably will develop creeping, right? But if I'm growing up in a house that has tile floor or wood floor, when I go onto my hands and knees and start rocking, it hurts my knees, right? So babies that grow up in that environment often come up with another strategy, right? And what they'll do is they'll bum scoot, right? So they've got a nice padded, shiny bottom, either a nappy or a toweling nappy, right? And they bum scoop themselves along the floor because it's shiny, right? And they can. Okay? So this is the start of self-locomotion, right? Once they're creeping or bum scooting, your life as the mum, dad is never the same, right? Because you put them down, you turn away, you go, they're not there anymore, right? Up until about 8 months, 7, 8 months, you could put them down, turn away, turn back, and they were still where you put them, right? Not now. Now they can self-locomote. Now they can go explore. Now they can go poke their little fingers into electrical holes, right? So by 8 months, you've got to have all those little plastic covers on your electric points, okay? All right, let me see. We might stop there. What else have we got? Oh, rate limiters. Yeah. All right, I think we'll stop there. And then we'll pick up with what happens from 9 months to a year. And then we will start chapter 5. Okay, so today's Tuesday, so on Thursday, we'll finish some of the information from chapter 4 about the next set of motor milestones, and we will start chapter 5. Okay? Any questions? Okay. So I'll see you